When it comes to watercolor painting, there are three main important tools that you need: paint, brushes, and the paper. But that's where it gets tricky, because if you go to the store to get watercolor paper, there's a couple different options for you to choose from. Well, which ones do you choose? Today, we're going to help you out and go over the different types to help you make the right decision. Before we get started, here's a brief explanation of how watercolor paper is different than other types of papers. Watercolor paper is a surface specifically designed for painting with watercolors. The special thing about watercolor paper is sizing, which is a type of glue used to bind the paper together. Sizing helps keep the water and paint pigment on the paper surface rather than letting it soak straight in, allowing the artist to continue working with the watercolor paint before it dries. Watercolor papers are made from cotton fibers or wood pulp, or a combination of both. There are many different types and finishes, and it's available as pads, blocks, sheets, or rolls, and in choice of weights and sizes. There, now we're going to break it down into the two key elements to look for in the paper, which is weights and the surface. Let's get started. The surface of the watercolor paper plays a key important part, not only with how your painting turns out, but also how the paint reacts when you put it down on the paper. To break it down, there are three surfaces to watercolor paper: rough, hot pressed, and cold pressed. But what's the difference? This is the kind of watercolor paper that has the most texture to it. It's great for a textured and loose feel to your painting. It's made by pressing the sheet of paper between sheets of textured felt as it dries. The heavy texture of the paper will allow you to get the most granulation out of your watercolors. Now we're going to go to the opposite side of the spectrum with hot pressed watercolor paper. This watercolor paper has a very smooth feel to it, with almost no tooth. Tooth refers to the surface feel of the paper. Generally, the more tooth a paper has, the rougher it feels. Hot pressed paper is great for painting detailed paintings and creating very smooth washes of color. Hot pressed paper is made by pressing the sheets through hot metal rollers to eliminate the textured surface during production. A word to the wise: hot pressed watercolor paper is less absorbent, so paint washes end up sitting on the surface of the paper for a long time. The last surface option is called cold pressed. Cold pressed paper has a texture that's kind of in between rough pressed and hot pressed. Cold pressed paper is made by pressing the sheets through, I'm sure you can guess by now, cold metal rollers going across, creating a texture on the surface. This is the popular go-to paper for most watercolorists. Cold press is more absorbent than hot pressed as the paint sinks into the little texture bumps and dimples on the surface. It's also important to note that the amount of texture will vary depending on the brand, because they all have different manufacturing processes. To sum it all up, there's no wrong choice. All of these different types of papers can create a beautiful work of art. It just depends if you're looking for extra texture and character added to your piece. The choice would be to use cold pressed, more textured paper. If you want a more smooth and versatile surface to go with pen, ink, or pencil, you'll want to choose hot pressed. I use both. Usually for my landscapes, I'll use a cold pressed watercolor paper for a more textured feel to it. But if I'm painting portraits with a smooth skin, I go ahead and choose hot pressed watercolor paper for its smooth surface. Now it's time to talk about watercolor paper weights. 1001, 1002. When we're talking about watercolor weights, we're not talking about how much it weighs, but instead we're talking about how thick or how absorbent the watercolor paper is.
Think of the weight term more like this. If you hold the watercolor paper by all four corners and then place a weight on it, how much would it hold?
When looking at the paper's weight, you may notice the abbreviation GSM, which stands for grams per square inch. The lower the GSM, the more the paper's gonna buckle.
The reference of pounds is more common in America, so you will hear weights like 90 pounds, 140 pounds, and 300 pounds. The 140 pound option is the most popular, while the 300 pound option is more desirable.
So how do you choose the weight that's best for you? Here's two things to think about. The cost. 140 pound paper is going to be the most cost effective. If you buy 300 pound paper, it's almost going to be double the cost. The second thing is buckling. Buckling refers to how the paper curls or warps as water is absorbed into the paper. You can almost guarantee that as soon as water starts hitting the 140 pound paper, it's going to start to buckle. Compared to 300 pound paper, which as soon as water starts hitting it, it will stay flat.
There are a few things to help prevent this. One of the biggest ways to do this is to soak your paper for an hour or so in water. Afterwards, pull it out and let the excess water drip off. Then, lay the paper on a hard, non-porous surface and staple it down around the edges.
Once the paper dries, it's ready to work and not buckle as much.
The other way watercolorists stop this is to simply tape down the edges of the paper to your painting surface. After painting, simply let the paper dry and then remove the tape.
That's the benefit of using 300 pound paper. It's not going to buckle, and if it does, it's very minimal. Why? Because it's thicker and can absorb more water. To finish up, let's talk about the different brands of watercolor paper. Actually, let's not. That part doesn't matter when you're first starting out. But we will in another later video talk about the different brands and a few pros and cons of the different kinds. Here's my recommendation. If you're a beginner, use 140 pound cold press paper.
If you're doing little practices or examples, don't worry about stretching the paper. Just secure it to a non-porous hard surface with tape around the edges.
If you've been painting in watercolor for a while, go ahead and start using the 300 pound paper. Trust me, you won't regret it.
If you're painting portraits, choose hot pressed or smooth paper. And if you're painting something with a little more texture than skin, such as a landscape, try your hand out with cold pressed paper.
In the next segment, it's going to be a quick one. We're going to go over how to set up your painting area. And then we're going to get into the fun stuff, which is actually painting. See you next time. Now go buy yourself some watercolor paper.